Welcome to Synthesis Workshop. This week we'll be starting a new module called Culture of Chemistry, where we explore the human aspects that accompany a career in chemistry. This week, to help kick off this segment, we have with us Dr. Marc Reid. Welcome, Marc.
Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here.
To give a little bit of introduction for Marc. Marc is originally from Glasgow, or is it Glasgow?
Glasgow.
Glasgow. Okay, so Marc is from Glasgow in Scotland. At least I said Scotland right. So Marc earned a master's in chemistry from the University of Strathclyde in 2011 and followed that up by doing a PhD in chemistry at Strathclyde with support from the Carnegie Trust. Then between 2015 and 2016, Marc was a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh and was inducted into the SciFinder Future Leaders in Chemistry program. In 2016, Marc was awarded a Leavenhulme Trust Early Career Fellowship and worked at Strathclyde in the Department of Pure and Applied Chemistry until very recently, when he was appointed a lecturer for innovation and education at the University of Bristol in the School of Chemistry. Marc has also founded a company focused on chemical safety called Presite Safety, and also serves on the editorial advisory board of the American Chemical Society journal ACS Chemical Health and Safety. Marc is also carrying out an online study on Imposter Syndrome, which is still ongoing. If you're interested in getting involved, feel free to reach out through his website or through Twitter. So with that, we know a little bit more about Dr. Marc. But one of the things that I was hoping to discuss today with Dr. Marc Reid is the imposter syndrome and the imposter phenomenon study that he's been doing recently. So how long has that been going on for?
Yeah, gosh, at this point it's been going on for longer than I expected, but there's good reason for that. So it came into its formalism around November 2019, and at that point I thought it would maybe go for a month or so, and we would collect some data, try some things out, and be done with it, perhaps write a paper. But the main part of it was really to supplement a feeling that I had about a particular trend that I was writing about for a book that I'm still working on the subject. But then once the interest continued to grow, we've kept the study open, we've kept it going all the way up until now in July 2020. And apart from all the rather obvious negative things that are going on around us at the moment, it was actually the fact that I could spend a little bit more time thinking more deeply about this study in the wake of lockdown and the coronavirus that sort of helped the study expand beyond what I ever imagined it could be.
Wow, that's really exciting. So, so what's the ultimate aim? Are you looking for publication, or are you looking just to make it publicly available, or what are you thinking about there?
Both and more. So yes. So from the scientific aspect, yeah, we would like to get it through peer review. We would like to get the formal numerical data up to that standard so that there's a scientific publication, but that was never really the primary goal. It's just got to this point now where that looks like an obvious option. As I had mentioned only briefly earlier, the original thought was actually to make some of the claims I had considered in a book that I'd been writing more robust. So there had been, for example, we're thinking about imposter syndrome, imposter phenomenon. I know we'll go into that in more detail. But in a nutshell, I had this sense that more and more people were talking about it. And a long story short, I'd started to collect some data from social media and other places. And when you look at that data over time, there is a rather compelling upward trend. And so I wanted to try to complement that data with more data from new participants and not simply rely on me looking backwards in time at papers that already existed or from second and third hand accounts from other people. I wanted to get a new approach to this very old problem.
So how broad are how many people has it expanded to at this point?
At this point, we've registered, I think, just north of 700 participants.
Okay, wow.
And of those, I think we're perhaps about 550, 600, confirmed responses to the structured survey that we've set up around the research.
Okay.
So that's what I was meaning earlier. I expected maybe 10, 20, 50 to give me a sense of something that I could complete for this book chapter. But then once it got into the hundreds, I thought, right, okay, there's far more to explore here, and there's more we can do with this for people.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I do want to talk about the book. So is the study the main focus of the book, or is there areas outside of that in the book, and what will that cover?
So yeah, that's a great point. The study is in no way the central focus of the book. That actually started. The whole story started around 2015. So that was the period in my life where I had just earned my PhD and I was going off for a new adventure for my postdoc. But around that time, moving city, moving groups, almost like moving a company, more or less, you're surrounded with a new group of people, and slowly but surely over the course of the first few months in that postdoc, I started to get a rather constant rush of overwhelming feelings that I didn't really belong there. And I kept comparing myself to my postdoc and other younger PhD colleagues, and I was completely obsessed with they're better at me than me in this dimension, this other person's better than me in that dimension, they've got papers that are cited this way and that way, these people can speak a way that I can't. And at that point, I was just thinking, what the hell's going on? And I didn't know what it was. I didn't have a name for it. I had no clue about the imposter syndrome and imposter phenomenon. So that actually started me on a path to really just get that out of my head. And the way that I did that was to start a private journaling exercise. So whenever this stuff came up, whenever those thoughts started coming into my head, I would write about it in an evening, about what had happened that day. And over the course of that 2-year position, that had started to look like a rather large document. And then the thoughts came into my mind about, well, this, there are various segments to this story here, various things that keep popping up, and those started to look like chapters. So the structure of the book is actually more of a personal narrative as to how I've first recognised this stuff, and then learned a hell of a lot along the way about managing it. And then the kind of last part of that is bringing it full circle to do the research that we opened with today.
Okay, cool. So going back to what you were saying about your postdoctoral experiences, would you say that this kind of something that stems from the way that we measure ourselves as scientists, that because we're expected to have this many papers, and that if you don't, then I guess you might have a kind of what seems like a legitimate reason to question your self-worth.
Yeah, you've opened a can of worms there. So, in a nutshell, what you're really getting at here is a sense of metrics, and that metric could be, as you've mentioned, that a certain number of papers. It could be a certain type of paper, let's say a paper in a higher or perceived higher impact journal. That would then lead you to look at impact factors. That might then lead you to look at someone's Google Scholar and H-index and all of those sorts of things. So you're absolutely right. There are numbers that you can pin against yourself to measure yourself in the standard that you're at. But that can very quickly and often does turn into the rather toxic trap of you comparing yourself to someone else. And we often forget that those metrics, whatever one happens to be your favourite, these are proxies for something else that's a little bit more intangible. And you can very quickly come to conclusions that you are not as good as person A, B, or C. And you haven't really stopped to consider the deeper story behind why you're making that comparison, or indeed how that person has got to where they are. The mind, for some reason, seems to jump to the conclusion that you're simply not as good or can never be good enough, and that brings it into the imposter phenomenon.
But does it feel like the reason we go there is because we put ourselves in the mind of like a third person judging us? We put our mind in the mindset of a future job interviewer saying, which candidate do I choose? This person has more papers, so I should choose them. And when we see it from this perspective, it's our inclination to think that the papers matter either in their number or their importance. and so not having them makes me not important.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, so we're very much down an academic line of inquiry here, right? And I certainly empathise with that thought. So I think to make this clearer, I could ask the question back to you: Has that been a line of inquiry that's come into your mind? Do you see the number of papers as mostly important to you?
Well, yeah, I don't know. This is something I experienced as a PhD student, where
Right.
I mean, so when I started the PhD, then I saw older PhD students, and I saw that they had not only a lot of papers but also high impact papers. And so I thought, I don't know if I can get a high impact paper, so let's just focus on the number for now, and we'll see if it's even possible to get one. And then that feeling of inadequacy still continues even after you have one and after you have two, and it's still but there are other people who have more and more and more, and even after those first people have stopped publishing and gone off and gotten jobs, then you still see higher and higher people who have achieved more and more. That it's infinitely humbling still, but yeah, the initial pressure of seeing people who have achieved what you think you're supposed to achieve, I guess, I guess it makes you think. First, it creates pressure, and second, it makes you think that if I don't have those things, then I'm not going to be adequate. As a job candidate, at least.
I think this is entirely understandable. I've certainly had similar thought processes myself on going between, let's say, PhD, postdoc to trying to achieve a fellowship, and even looking sideways at things that are not academic. I'll take this in two parts, but when I listen to you speak, I'm reminded of a story from my past on someone trying to help me with this long before I was ever really deep into academia. And way back when I was much fitter, I'm now a shadow of my former self. I used to work in a gym, so I was a personal trainer for a while, many, many years ago. And one of the colleagues I worked with at the time was listening to me speak about, achieving a certain level of fitness, which you can in a way think is parallel to the level of mental achievement we're talking about here. But I was, frustrated along the lines of what you've mentioned. I would get to one particular level, you could lift a certain weight or run at a certain speed or jump a certain height, and there was always someone better. It didn't really matter what level you were at. To use your rather poetic term there was an infinite level of humbling experiences, one after the other. And what this colleague of mine said to me, which the more I go on in life, the more I realise was hitting the nail on the head, was the comparison that you have to make is between you now and you then. Because if it's you now versus someone else, then that is an infinite line. That's never going to stop. There's always going to be someone who can lift more, run faster, jump higher. That will never ever stop. And if you keep chasing that, that is a sure path to madness. And I've found stories like that in writing this book. There are stories like that from in and well beyond our realm of chemistry and even academia that shows that that's absolutely true. There's a madness behind perfectionism that we would do very well to recognise, because it's a massive step on the way to competing with yourself and not anyone else.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Especially as someone who in the past and in the present is something of a perfectionist, then that's something that you feel is a self-pressure that you try to avoid, and is unnecessary in some cases. In any case, so you were talking about this possibility of management. So do you see imposter syndrome as being something that can be managed, and have you learned anything about how it can be managed?
Yeah, there's lots there. I think we could actually maybe take this in a baby step from the question you've just asked about metrics, because this will sound challenging and perhaps even offensive to people at the independent academic level, at my level or more. But if you're the kind of person who is hiring people solely on the basis of that single metric, you're not doing a very good job. You're perhaps making your life easier to cut the stack down to compare people. But if you're looking solely at the number of papers, you're not really looking into what has perhaps led to that number of papers, or what else that person could bring to the party.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Apart from writing papers, so I think this is a two-way street. I think there's the worry, the understandable worry we can have about applying to a job or applying to work with a certain person, but we should try to treat that as a two-way street, such that they're applying to have you as well. So I say that as if it sounds rather obvious, but it's taken me a very long time to think that way as well. And I think just as you get a little bit older, you get more comfortable, generally speaking, with challenging some things that you accepted as gospel in the past.
Yeah.
So your main question was really about how to manage this sort of stuff, and that has really been that rather personal journey I've been on since early 2015. And I stick to the word managing to come to the first part of what I want to say to you here, is because I think there's a lot out there that badges things as a cure for imposter syndrome, or how to defeat or how to crush imposter syndrome. I think there's parts of human psychology where you need to realise that there's a good chance that these things will never ever go away. Because, as I've said to others in the past, you are not the only person inside your head. There is the conscious you, in which you attribute all your characters, the logical part of your brain, but then there's the far more primitive part, which is scared of everything, cares only for survival, and passing things on to the next generation of you. And a lot of the time, it's that far more powerful and often uncontrollable part of us that speaks up and keeps bringing these things back. So when I say managing things, it's almost like managing the two people that are really inside your head, and making sure that it's the logical part that can stay more and more in control, and to recognise and not defeat, not crush, not cure, but quieten the thoughts that lead to imposter experiences. I'd say that's the overarching thing.
So your view is that it's this primitive part that causes it and the logical part that allows us to manage it? Or is it the logical part that's kind of responsible for both?
That's a great point. I would say that the primitive part is the one that hits the panic button.
Okay.
When I say it's managing it, it's like, the logical part is everything at the level that we're speaking about just now. You could look at yourself in a mirror and say all this to yourself as if you're speaking to another person, when actually what you're doing is partly trying to convince the chimp inside your head that nothing is going to physically harm you at the moment. That can certainly happen at an interview, when you're about to go up on stage or sit down for your annual review. There's the sense of impending doom because you're about to be judged by others.
Yeah.
And whilst logically, consciously, you know that it's harmless, and you know that you're going to live to fight another day, there's part of you that doesn't know that.
Yeah.
And it's beneath the surface, but it's always there. I could guess right now, you could tell me, right, if you remember the last time you stood up to give a presentation.
Yeah.
How did you feel before it?
Yeah, it's always nervous. I mean, it's always the feeling of, increasingly going on with time that it'll be fine based on your experiences, but there is still the intrinsic feeling that I might completely mess this up. I might use all the worst words I know and say lies. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not overly qualified to go into this in a lot of depth.
Okay.
But there is, along the lines of managing, a really popular, very pervasive technique called cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT. And a lot of that is framed around the idea of calling nonsense on a lot of these thoughts and thinking about yourself rather mindfully, as if to be in the third person, as if you're having an out-of-body experience where you, in your infinite logic, can look down on the whole of you who happens to be panicking in a particular situation. And cognitive behavioural therapy goes into splitting up different types of scenarios and responses, which you can begin to badge and recognise, and therefore deal with in a more logical fashion. So, for example, I think there's around 10 different traits or behaviours that would be called out by cognitive behavioural therapy. One of them is catastrophizing. So you can blow up a situation to make it seem like there's a mountain rather than a molehill.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and you're panicking when you don't need to. And there's another one, trying to predict the future, the fortune teller. You know, you're almost assuming that you're going to mess up that presentation or balls up the interview or do something before you've ever actually had a chance to get in the room and prove otherwise. You know, you're almost jumping to the worst conclusions. So there are ways around, not defeating these things, but recognising them such that you can see them for what they truly are.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like a good approach. So you were talking about the journaling. Is that kind of a way of doing that just for yourself?
Yeah, and I would strongly recommend that everyone does it. It never, ever has to see the light of day. And in the beginning, I had no intention of, and in fact, there's probably 90% of what I had originally written that will never see the light of day. It's just sort of grown beyond that naturally. But the very act of doing it is to see physically the things inside your head and start to rationalise your thoughts slowly on paper. You know, I've spoke to a good friend of mine about this who, for a while, we trialled letter writing between one another rather than going online and doing all the easy stuff that's at our fingertips now. And you can see in the nature of that rather arcane process now that you write things in a different way. You have more time to think. You have created silence around you to hear and spell out these thoughts. And I think it's something that's perhaps being increasingly lost as letter writing itself gets lost in the wake of more technologically advanced ways of communicating. But if you do that, you can look at that piece of paper and start to objectify the stuff that was in your head. And for me, when I did that, I could start to see myself and, be the referee of my own thoughts and see when it was just absolute nonsense.
Yeah.
This is a really, really good way to get things out of your head and stop scrambling and going in circles.
Yeah. So going into your study a little bit more.
Sure.
Yeah. So when I got my score back, I was a little bit, I guess my first thought was, there's no way it's that high, right? I mean, I've had some experiences with the things described in this study, but I can't believe it's this high. So I guess my first question about the numbering of the study is how do we know whether it's tuned correctly or what is the basis for this numbering system?
Yeah, it's a great point. So a few steps back for people who may not have encountered any of the background to this study. So
sure.
From the origins of studying the imposter phenomenon from, back in the early to late 1970s, when it was first coined, there was a need to start to codify the experience in such a way that people could be surveyed on it, and you could start to get a sense of whether someone had regular, chronic, intense imposter experiences or weren't really affected by them, or maybe was affected on moderate occasions, sometimes not. And so one of the measures of this, by one of the original discoverers of the imposter phenomenon, or codifiers, I should say, was Dr. Pauline Clance, who had over a number of years developed a scale that was over 20 questions, and people would answer whether or not they agreed or disagreed with certain statements.
Okay.
And then the scores from those statements can be ranked to give an indication, I say strongly, an indication of whether or not someone is more or less likely to have such experiences that are under the umbrella of the imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome. So you've mentioned a number in the 80s. The scale goes from 0 to 100, 0 being, this person has never encountered it, is never bothered by it, has never ever had a single imposter experience, up to 100, which would indicate frequent, chronic, very intense feelings of being an imposter.
Yep.
And so you can infer from that the levels in between. So we've done that as part of this study. There's a deeper part to this that we're not really ready to talk about yet, but that the first part, the part that you've seen, is to give people to give them an indication, an awareness of where they might be in this, back to your earlier point, ways that they might recognise in themselves the tendency to behave in this way that they can start to address. So we've released those numbers now for about 500 participants, and off the back of that, we've had more people coming forward who have been curious, and we've kept the study open so that more people can come forward to learn where they lie on that scale, and then at a later date, which I'm happy to speak to you about another time, look at the deeper implications of the study that we've designed.
Okay. So do you have a sense for how, reproducible we can say that these numbers are? I mean, do people take the study more than once and see different results, or on different days, for example? Or is it a number is a number?
No, you raise a rather deep point about any survey research, and it's perhaps something, arguably, that as chemists, as physical scientists, we don't encounter that much because it's really in the realm of psychology, sociology and such.
Okay.
Survey research, at its heart, is cursed by the fact that it depends on your sample. It depends when someone takes a study. It depends what's going on around them. It depends on what the demographic is. It depends on who's running the study and what their network are and what people they actually have access to doing a study. There have been arguments made that a lot of people who do a study are within a particular tendency to take surveys in the first place.
Okay.
And that's one of the other reasons that we've kept this going so long. This comes to your point about, is it a number or not? We're trying to get as broad a cross-section of people as possible so that we can start to delineate these things and account for instance, whether someone is coming into this study because they know the subject intimately,
yep,
or whether it's someone who's coming in who's just perhaps curious and has never really engaged with the subject before. So we're looking at all of those things in as cute a detail as possible so that we can be very, very careful about the conclusions that we try to draw from the study overall.
Okay. So can you say anything about the kinds of trends you've seen so far? So just to give, I guess, a little bit of background. So you said that there's the portion of the study which is about generating the score, but then there's also a free-form part, right?
That's right.
So that's not related to the score at all, right?
No, that's really to get the deeper sense of specific scenarios, the case studies, and feelings behind a lot of this stuff. That's the chapter 2, if you like, that we'll come back to on another occasion. That's the real, that's what's under the black box. That's the stuff that will really help us understand things in a lot more detail.
Yeah. Is there a kind of overarching theme about the root causes that you see in triggering this? Is it always at like the interface of 2 points in a career?
Well, that's another great question, because that's one of the common scenarios, but it's by no means the only one. So you're asking about trends that we've seen so far and people who have taken part. So to the earlier point about network, this is quite naturally because of my own position here, primarily being people from the public sector.
Okay.
So about 3/4 of the people who have taken part work at a university or another public body, but about 1/4, because I have some connections outside of university life, have been from the private sector or entrepreneurs and that sort. But we're trying to keep that as broad as possible. But if you sort of ignore all of that for a moment and just look at the broad trends, you do see that more often than not. The numbers are not evenly distributed around 50. There's, if on that scale of 0 to 100, it's not the case that you have 50 as the mean or the median and equal distribution on either side of that. For a bell curve, there's quite a lot of skew that we're seeing. And this comes back to the original point you raised about some of the aims behind this and why I had done this for the book. So I had originally had the sensation that more and more people were talking about this sort of stuff. But also there was a sense of loneliness that it could just be me.
Yeah.
That was one of the things that scared me the most. And through this study and through the earlier research I mentioned, it's become very, very clear that you, anyone listening to this that might have felt the same way, we're most certainly not alone.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of folks out there who feel this way.
Yeah. So has this, like, doing this study informed the way that you are behaving as a mentor, the way that you act in to lead your group? I guess you're probably thinking a lot more now about the kind of psychological state of your students and the students that you're teaching as well. No?
In a way, yes. But if I take the modesty hat off for a moment, it's probably the reverse. This is something that I've been obsessed with for quite a long time. More broadly, not just imposter phenomenon, but leadership in general. So, I keep a leadership blog where, I've been writing for several years now about different aspects of leading a team that to some people who might think more traditionally is rather counterintuitive. So the ability to lead not by tyranny, but as a genuine modern leader who can be empathetic and motivational towards each and every individual, no matter where they want to go next. That's absolutely crucial. And this imposter study, because it had personally affected me, is one dimension on that much, much bigger challenge of leadership. And we can go into lots of stuff there if you want, but I would firmly say that, I'd been thinking about this much more than just in terms of imposter phenomenon. And a part of that has been the good fortune of having an independent position over the past 3+ years and increasingly moving towards that through postdoc and earlier.
Yeah.
And anyone who's a leader worth their salt will openly say that they don't always get it right and that their style is always reforming and evolving towards something better.
Yeah.
In my earlier years, during my PhD, even when I was a mature PhD student, if I look back now, I wouldn't say I was a fit leader back then. I was probably a lot more competitive than I am now. I was more obsessed with those metrics that I've got a much healthier relationship with these days.
Yeah.
I feel more collaborative now than I used to back then. I think parts of our system in doing a PhD force individual and not team thought, which isn't very healthy. So back then, I could never have led a team the way that I do now. It has been a multi-year process to read and learn far beyond the scope of the chemistry textbooks and papers that are always at the front of our mind.
Yeah. So talking about those papers for a second. So I guess so there are a lot of there are new papers and new reagents and new ideas in chemistry that are coming out every day now. And I guess in addition to the metrics, the paper metrics, both in number and in perceived value of a paper, then there's also the fact that there's just this overwhelming amount of new information in chemistry, especially. And I guess that when you hear people speaking, or even as an undergraduate, we hear people speaking about organic chemistry, and it sounds like a foreign language. And then you think, oh, I finally mastered it. And then you become a PhD student, and you start to hear this even more complex dialect of the foreign language. Now they're talking about diastereoselectivities selectivities and the Falcon-On effect. All this, all these, very niche terms that really disconnect the specialist from the novice.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so do you think that there's something about the way that the specialists are speaking about chemistry that is causing a kind of imposter syndrome in newcomers to the field?
Yeah, I think this is a great and very probing question that a lot of people would do well to ask more. So I'm thankful to you for raising this, and I hope a lot of people hear it. In my world, I think about the specialist versus the generalist.
Okay.
And I think a lot of the way that our system is set up in academia promotes hyper-specialisation and not a generalist mindset. And because it's so competitive as well, you need to remember that for a lot of people, making something sound complicated is in their interest to do so, right? Because they want to keep the hurdle high, they want to keep the number of competitors low, and they want to scare people away when they can. You know, that sounds very cynical. That's not to say these people are not collaborative. That's not to say they're not good at their job. It's not to say that they're not very clever. But what it is saying is that there is a curtain to be drawn back here for many people who would like to enter a field but feel intimidated to do so.
Yeah.
And when I say specialist versus generalist, I have tended, and you know, this is perhaps just my nature, but I know others who have tended to be more generalist thinkers.
Yeah.
You know, in the business world, you might hear this described more as a T-shaped person where you have one core of expertise. So for me, in my training, I would say that's probably in physical organic chemistry.
Okay.
You know, doing a bit of synthesis, but focusing more on studying mechanism. But, you know, the top part of the T for me is going broader and broader. And for a while, I felt like I had to apologise for being interested in a lot of stuff, rather than being a hyper specialist. And I think now I realise that this is partly how we are rewarded as academics. You know, a lot of people will see you playing or holidaying in another field, and they'll kind of want you to go away because that's their little sandpit. That's not yours. But when you start to think that way, you realise, and this is coming really to your point, that there are ways into fields where you don't have to use the jargon all the time. You can approach things from a different angle. You can perhaps get 80% of the benefit for 20% of the time spent in that field without worrying about being an absolute master in that area.
Yeah.
And if you do that, then what that opens up is the ability, which I find most exciting, is to connect these different worlds in ways that a hyper-specialist just can't.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, I mean, I guess when I encounter a specialist, I'm obviously very impressed by the amount of time and dedication that they've spent honing their skills in a particular area. But then the other part of me is thinking, you know, if I put this fish in a different pond, can he still swim? And that, you know, that's not always the case. I guess, yeah. I mean, like you, there are a lot of benefits to being the generalist, and then also being able to connect the different specialists to be able to network them together to solve the bigger problems. But so, do you think that the generalist faces less of a imposter syndrome mentality? Because
not necessarily.
Okay.
So I'm taking really just my personal experience here, but I think much of this is internal, and we can perhaps come to this, but some of this can be born out of how you've grown up and where you've grown up.
Okay.
But a large part of this can be induced by external factors. So when I mentioned, you know, I've largely been fortunate enough to have a very, very supportive mentor base and network. But in my broader adventures in the world, I've come across sections of various groups who would look on generalism with disdain, because the assumption is that, well, if you're a generalist and interested in all these things, you can't be very serious about the thing that you claim to have trained in.
Yep.
And when you see a group of people thinking that way, then that chimp in the brain does start to come out again, and you feel threatened. You feel like you're going to be exiled. You feel like, you know, perhaps I am just faking it here. Perhaps if I just fall into line and think as all these other people do, then these feelings will go away.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's many ways that this can play out. So that externalism is one way. The other thing I mentioned there is that this can come from a lot of imposter experiences are those tending towards an imposter experience can have had that seeded at a very young age.
Okay.
So something I found deeply fascinating when I first started learning about the subject in more detail was that in your home growing up, our parents, of course, where they can, trying to do the very best for us. If you're in a home of siblings, for example, there can be a rather natural, unconsciously harmful tendency to characterise one sibling in a particular way and another sibling in a different way.
Really?
This is the clever one, they're the smart one, or they're the kind one.
Okay.
They're the generous one, but this one's the angry one. And some of it is highly playful, and it seems like folks are doing a good thing, but there can then be seeded a temptation or an inevitability in that child to want to play up to that.
Yep.
And a way that this plays out more broadly in society is, and one of the things that comes up as a particular scenario for the imposter phenomenon is the first in a family to go to university.
Okay.
First in the family to go to college, or something along those lines, where you feel the pressure is on your shoulders to help raise your family to that level and do them proud, where perhaps previous generations have never had that opportunity.
Yeah.
And I think this point in time is really a hot spot for that. We are coming off the back of just a few generations before us who weren't being asked to sit on their ass while a virus was cleared out. They were being asked to put a gun in their hand and go to war. And there's, as generations go on, I've read in some books, for example, so a great example of this is in Malcolm Gladwell's book Outliers, that talks about the trend of, if you look in previous generations, you'll tend to find more manual labour, and as generations go on, depending on where you're looking in the world, then you can see a hop onto higher level professions.
Okay.
And I think for our generation, perhaps the previous one as well, there was a lot of those opportunities to hop from more manual jobs to higher level disciplines.
Yeah.
And so that is one scenario where you can feel that pressure to rise to the occasion, and it's always with you.
Yeah.
So you might always feel that you're never good enough to do it.
So have you had a lot of participants in your study from larger family structures that you can learn about?
Yeah, we've still got to go into a lot of that data, but we have seen examples of it creeping up, when we're going in to look at the data and make sure that answers are being recorded faithfully. And you can see some examples of that where someone might talk about particular siblings or pressure from parents, pressure from other guardians, or things like that. And it's very, very hard to conflate various different experiences here. But what I'm really saying is that some of these scenarios, some of these life experiences can lead to the imposter experiences, among other things. So you can talk separately about self-esteem, for example, or your work ethic. Because the thing that makes the imposter phenomenon difficult for a lot of people to grasp is that it is rather an umbrella term for a lot of things underneath it. That's why these surveys are not a single question, but 20 questions or more, because there are various dimensions to the experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. Can I ask if you're from a larger family?
I'm not. I'm from rather a small family.
Okay.
So my wife's from a much larger family. So on my side, to quantify this in rough terms, I have 3 cousins in this world. She has many tens.
Okay.
And I can't count. And on my side, the family size has tended to be rather small for the past few generations, whereas on my wife's side, her families and their siblings have tended to be larger in number.
Okay.
So I guess in my case, I'm definitely one of those folks who are pretty much the first in the family to go through to higher and tertiary education at the university level and beyond. And I have a couple of younger siblings, and looking back now, I do think unconsciously I have over the years felt the unnecessary pressure to perhaps be the smart one and just keep doing well in exams, keep studying, keep going further.
Yep.
And it's self-imposed pressure for the most part. And again, as I get older, as I learn more about this and hopefully teach other people about it, it's another thing that I've recognised. I'm saying recognised again, it's not going away, but now that I'm recognising it, I have a much, much healthier perspective and relationship with my place in time.
Yeah, moving away from the cases that are first in a family to go to university, if we're talking about another scenario where parents have achieved X, so the child feels like they also need to achieve X. If the father's a doctor, the son should be at least a doctor, if not more, Do you see that as being a kind of other or parallel problem from different family structures?
I think so, yeah. I think if you really challenge yourself here, it's not really too different a case. There's still a pressure from an older generation to a younger, and then the younger maintains that pressure themselves. So a way that this is, if we sort of abstract to the level of how this manifests across many different types of imposter experience, you'll often hear about the imposter cycle. And this happens a lot in academia. I was actually quite frightened to read this at first and just thought, this is a bio sketch here. This is a biography of how I live my daily life.
Yeah.
And that cycle goes like this. You will start a project. You'll plan it out. That project will mature over time and you'll work harder and harder on it, put in more and more hours. And then as it gets closer to crunch time, you might start to procrastinate more. You might start to worry or turn it into a catastrophe, really start to think that things are going to fail.
Yeah.
But then once the job is done and things are almost coming full circle, you'll stop for no more than a moment to celebrate that win, to pat yourself in the back for a job well done. But then it starts again because you think there's always more work to do.
Yeah. That's really hard.
Rather than talking about the infinite line, as you put it earlier, it's like things running in vicious circles now, which is also infinite, right? So you can go round and round and round and never ever convince yourself to stop for a break.
Yeah. So in your experiences, did those first landmark achievements, like getting your first paper and then getting your first, different achievements, does it still carry the same weight for you each time, or do you feel like it becomes less and less valuable? Each paper feels like less and less of a pat on the back, and makes you feel like you still have so far to go. Or do you feel like it's a problem that gets slowly resolved through the different cycles that you go through?
Yeah, it's a very complex point there. I would say that the story you tell yourself about each paper changes over time. Yeah. So I remember my first paper I was elated with. It was in 2013. If you looked at the impact factor, and if you were the sort of person that cared about impact factor, you'd probably be disgusted with the level of the impact factor. It was next to nothing, but it very quickly taught me that the journal that went in was actually for a very, very particular community, and everyone who read that journal would probably see your paper and very quickly start to apply the science in your paper.
Okay.
And so rather fortunately, because of the field I was working in at the time, that gave me a very quick lesson that it wasn't all about that particular number tagged to a journal. So I'm always thankful for that. And then as time goes on, the story changed to, this is my first higher impact paper. Or this is my first paper that involves this type of science. I've taken a step in a new direction. And what's really just started to happen for me now is to see papers that, you know, it's not just all about me being a first or second author anymore. It's about leading a team that does the great work and, you know, perhaps being the corresponding author. And then going beyond that, because you can, each of these stories, you could be tempted to stop there and go round and round in circles. You know, I could stop at this level and say, oh, I just want more and more corresponding author papers, or I just want more and more first name papers.
Yep.
But now the story's changing again, because a lot of the science I've been working on with my team in the past few years has taken a massive step away from whatever my original training was.
Okay.
And, you know, arguably some of it is in a field that I've had almost no training in professionally.
Okay.
And I like that because it's a challenge to myself to see that I can get over these thoughts of not being good enough to contribute to these other fields, or, you know, feeling the pressure to stay in a particular silo.
Yeah.
That's where the story is for me now. And as time goes on, whether it's about papers or something else, I think this is really the general point I'd love to make, is that it comes back to that point in the gym. The healthiest thing to do is to compare you now versus you then, and make sure that you're always playing the game against yourself.
Yeah.
And not for anyone else.
Yeah, that's really good.
There's plenty of systems out there that will tempt you into playing the game for the sake of the game. And having some knowledge of what game theory is and how you can be, your will can be turned against you to play these other games. But the only one that you can ever win is making you now better than you then.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. So what is the title of your book?
It has changed over the years, but the one I've now stuck with and got a cover for is "You Are Not a Fraud," and the "not" is in brackets and hidden away. We're going to have perhaps several covers for it that we're playing with for various editions. But yeah, the message there is that you're always tempted to say that you are a fraud, and the "not" is often hidden or something that needs to emerge over time.
Yeah.
So I've sort of subtitled it as a scientist's memoir on the imposter syndrome, because it is in that sort of story-like fashion of there's been a number of very, very dark moments along the way where this was all-consuming, and it was after, you know, a lot of reading or a lot of experiences, stumbling across other people and other subjects who have known this more intimately, that have helped me crawl out of that hole and recognise this at every turn, and not allowing it to consume me as it once did.
Yeah.
And researching that up until this point has taken me from chemistry to physics to high-end cuisine, back to chemistry again, to the history of management, to metrics and how impact factor first came around. It has been a rather wild journey that's not quite finished yet.
Okay.
But when everything has come back down to earth, all of it has led me to that previous point.
Okay.
Whatever you do, compare yourself to you now versus you then, and aim for what you want for yourself next, and not what someone else wants for you.
That's a really good message. Cool.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. All right. I think that's all the questions I have for you today.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed this. And, you know, I should say for your audience as well, I think that you yourself are a great example of someone who's taken risk and not simply sticking to what they think they should be doing. You know, I think the synthesis workshop is something that the community could have had many years ago. Many people have cried out for, and you've gone and done it. You've taken a risk, and you're producing some great content. And it does relate to what we've said, because in looking through your own content, it reminded me of something that popped up in my postdoc, where we once had a rather large argument amongst many chemists from different backgrounds, some of who loved total synthesis and some who didn't like it at all. And it reminded me of, at that time, trying to bring the message to people that there are different ways that you can look at these problems, come at them from different angles, so that you don't have to be scared away just because you're not an organic chemist, for example.
Yeah.
And I think the way that you're creating this new content and telling these stories is giving people another route into something that they might otherwise find very scary. So
congratulations.
So. Thanks. We'll see. I hope I can keep it going. But I'm happy to be able to explore the other aspects of having a career in chemistry by having people like you on our show. So I hope we can keep adding more and looking at the different sides of the human aspects of having a career in chemistry through these kinds of conversations. Thank you for watching this episode. If you enjoyed it, please support us by liking and subscribing, and feel free to send us any questions and comments you have. Follow us on Twitter to stay up to date, and see you all next time.